It seems like a cool idea. I get it. Let everybody do everything. The ultimate collaborative environment. Awesome. I love that. Whoop-de-doo. Hooray for everybody. But in effect, it leads to a development studio, a company that functions more like a daycare than an actual company. Gee whiz, the hair is doing something weird today. I don't know, looks like I pulled it out of a cake mold. I need a shearing real bad, don't I? Bethesda Game Studios has put out some really fantastic titles in the past. Whether you look at Morrowind, Oblivion, Skyrim, even Fallout 3, a game that is far from one of my favorites ever released. Maybe I'll do a critique of it someday, but still a pretty well-made game if you look at it objectively. All of those titles, they seem to have been put out with a lot of passion, heart, and soul at the core of the development team. They cared about what they were putting out, and I think that's part of the reason that they got away with so many technical issues in their games for so long. It was because there was so much heart and soul and passion in their titles, people were willing to look the other way because it was worth it even still. However, people's patience is finite, and when you start to take advantage of that patience and that forgiveness and tolerance, people notice. And this is where the house of cards for Bethesda started to collapse around Fallout 4 and of course especially around Fallout 76. Now I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out exactly what happened because it seems as though up until the point of Skyrim, everything was going great for Bethesda. I think most people would agree. In 2011 and 12, the majority of gamers had a very positive outlook on Bethesda Game Studios. You fast forward to 2015, after the launch of Fallout 4, most people had a fairly mediocre view of them. It was tapered for sure. And after the release of Fallout 76, across the board, their public image has tanked. And most of this seems to be due to managerial decisions. The decisions of the people that are producing the game, finding the money, budgeting everything out, and also the directors who are making the creative decisions, who are greenlighting what are objectively terrible decisions in their games. And whenever there's something like this in a company, you have to ask yourself which of two options it is, because clearly something has changed. Either a new manager has come in, or managers have come in and are instituting new practices across the board. These practices aren't being received well or aren't doing well, and that's why you see all of the dysfunction. The second option is much more likely in the case of Bethesda Game Studios, because the management hasn't changed. They weren't bought out, they didn't have a new CEO come in and take over. They didn't have a new studio director take over. It's still Todd Howard. All of the management's the same. So clearly some decision was made around 2012 that permanently changed the course of Bethesda Game Studios forever. And guess what? I figured out what it was. So that's what this video is going to be about. What I have deemed the odd Todd fallacy. The one thing that Todd Howard has put into place at Bethesda Game Studios, which initially seemed very promising, which is why he bragged about it in 2012, but which has proved to be an unmitigated disaster in practice. So buckle in, we're gonna get into the nitty-gritty. It's gonna be pretty fun. Make sure to like and subscribe for more content like this moving forward. And of course, thank you to NordLocker for sponsoring this video. So I began researching this topic by digging into a lot of the interviews that Todd Howard gave around the launch of Fallout 3 and Skyrim, because it seemed to me, in my estimation, that there was a marked shift in how Bethesda Game Studios was approaching the development process around this time, sometime between 2008 and 2011. They started moving towards much larger scales. They started moving towards things that were easy to market, easy to sell to the broad public, and across the board, they stopped trying to appeal to such a small niche of gamers as they had with previous games such as Morrowind, and they started moving towards a much broader public appeal. And there was also a change in how they were developing these games, because when you go back and you play something like Morrowind or even Oblivion, kind of a midpoint game, and you compare that to Fallout 3 or Skyrim, there's a real sharp difference, and it feels as though they were made by two completely separate companies. And I don't think it's a coincidence that around the time when these games started to shift away from their old feeling was the time that Todd Howard was starting to take over a much more senior position at the studio. Now, I've bashed Todd Howard a fair number of times over the last few years. He's not my friend. I don't have to suck up to him. I don't care if I'm not invited to press events. I'm just gonna say what I think, and I hope that people can respect that. But I will give him credit where credit is due. He clearly knew what he was doing and did a very good job in 2008 with Fallout 3 and in 2011 with Skyrim. I think objectively those are very impressive titles, and whatever you say about Todd Howard, you have to admit he is one hell of a salesman. But he started instituting some changes in how they approached titles, specifically after the launch of Fallout 3, or at least this is what he said was the major turning point in his presentation at DICE in 2012 after the launch of Skyrim. Now, you can go see this full talk. In totality, it's just under an hour long. It's really interesting and I recommend it fully. I'll have it linked below in the description. In this talk, Todd Howard goes on and on about the major decisions that formed what would eventually be Skyrim, how he developed the game based off of a singular picture at the inception of the game as an idea, how he had a little action figure on his desk and that action figure informed the feeling and tone of the entire game throughout the initial ideation process. It's really fascinating, actually. But there are two things that he says in this talk which are indicative of a major shift in Bethesda Game Studios' approach to quality. He says, for one, great games are simple and feel their best when there's a bunch of simple mechanisms interacting with each other to create a broader, more complex experience.
Second rule of game development is keep it simple. This one's, everybody uses this.
I think that's true objectively, especially when you look at a control such as Breath of the Wild, a game that has many simplistic systems that work together in unison to create a living, breathing world. I think Skyrim's a great game, don't get me wrong, but I think Breath of the Wild is the better example of this in practice because it has so many simplistic systems that interweave into a knot like my hands. They interweave and it creates a much broader, more complex experience, but something that's still approachable because the systems on an individualized basis are still approachable and understandable. So the first point of keeping an experience simple is not overtly concerning, especially at the outset, but it's when the second point comes along that you might start to see where it gets concerning. And you know what? I'll just let Todd explain this point for himself.
This is our number one rule, which is great games are played, not made. You have to play your own game a ton. We have about 100 people on the team at Bethesda Game Studios. Believe it or not, we did not focus test Skyrim at all. It was just us.
He says that great games are played, not made. And so the conclusion he comes to after this initial presupposition is that they shouldn't focus test their games, and that's why they didn't focus test Skyrim throughout the development process. They just had their own staff, the people that were making the game, play it. And then he shows some charts that explain how the development process was going to work for them, how they normally would spend a lot of time creating, designing, and setting up and fixing stuff. And then at the end of the development process, they would have the chance to polish up and play the game themselves. But he wanted to expedite the creation process so much so that they'd be able to just play it for hours and hours on end, or weeks or months in effect. And so, okay, he wants to eliminate focus testing. He thinks that's a waste of time because the designers should be playing the game anyways. Okay, I can live with that. But the third thing that he brings up as one of the major shifts that Bethesda Game Studios had undergone during the development of Skyrim, I think almost single-handedly explains the dysfunction we've seen in their most recent titles. You see, he says that because these development teams are becoming much older and they've worked together for so many years, in many cases you've got developers that have been on the same team for 10, 15, 20 years working on projects together. So he says that these people are deemed ninjas.
So we have found that we can have a lot less structure. We're getting more ninjas on the team, guys or women who can do a lot of stuff, and we let them run wild. And we're getting a lot of features and giving them the keys to the creativity and saying, well, make something cool. Here's the vibe. Here's what we want.
These ninjas are able to do a ton of different things that other developers wouldn't be able to do. In effect, they're a jack of all trades. They can code, they can quest design, they can write different narrative sections, they can do it all. Should they, though? That's a good question, but Todd Howard doesn't really answer that, since it's sort of detrimental to his argument that ninjas are a good thing and that these people that are able to do a ton of stuff should be allowed to. You see, in all of these interviews around this time, Todd Howard talks about these developers who are very talented and can do a ton of different things at once. So what he did around that time was that he removed a lot of these barriers in the structure of the company to make sure that those ninjas were able to freely work on what they wanted to work on, so that they'd be able to go and wear all of the different hats that they wanted in order to help progress the project along. It doesn't sound bad, but follow me here. Add in an entire another studio in another state that you are expected to collaborate with on a massive project 4 times the size in terms of map size of your last project. How is that supposed to go well when your last few productions have been entirely based around the idea that your team is able to do whatever they want in the moment? It would cause a lot of dysfunction. If Bethesda didn't put in the proper strictures and guidelines for communication, establish these communication networks, scheduling all of these roundtables and interviews and discussions with the directors and other staff at each one of the development studios in each of the locations, if they didn't do that, and I think it very reasonable to think that they didn't, then of course, we would see the dysfunction that's been present in Bethesda game studios over the last few years, where they seem incapable of even releasing simple patches for their games without releasing the wrong patch. It's so blindly incompetent, people are thinking that perhaps they're even doing it on purpose, when in reality, I think it's just that these teams were never taught or instructed or given the tools to properly communicate between each other. And so you've ended up with one hand doing one thing, the other hand doing another thing, and you're expecting a magical product to result from it. In fact, if that's really what's going on here, it's pretty remarkable that we got a game released at all, a game that boots up. And I know sometimes it doesn't even do that, but still. And this is the great big fallacy at the core of Fallout 76 and Bethesda game studios in general over the last 5 years or so. They changed how they were developing these games in an attempt to encourage broader and greater creativity within the teams themselves by allowing people to wear different hats and do different things. But that's a fallacy, because at its core, it leads to dysfunction, inefficiency, and blind incompetence when people think that they can wear that hat that they shouldn't be wearing. It seems like a cool idea, I get it. Let everybody do everything. The ultimate collaborative environment. Awesome. I love that. Whoop-de-doo. Hooray for everybody. But in effect, it leads to a development studio, a company that functions more like a daycare than an actual company. I mean, really, it's no wonder why all of their releases over the last 5, 6, 7 years have been utter heaps of garbage. But there's many other implications to this, specifically with regards to Starfield and to The Elder Scrolls 6, which I'm going to talk about in just a moment. But quickly, I want to say thank you to our sponsor for this video, NordLocker. NordLocker is the groundbreaking file encryption service from the developers of NordVPN. It works fantastically well, and I've started using it on a daily basis. Now, I do a lot of business with a lot of companies from all over the world, and as a part of this process, you're sharing a lot lot of information which is private, such as your address, credit card information, bank information, insurance information, all of these things that you don't want just leaking into somebody who happens to swipe up your data. So while you could just send it through email or another file transfer service and hope for the best, I decided to take the extra step of making sure that my data was protected. So I use NordLocker. All you got to do is you open up the program, you literally just drag and drop your information and data into this file. It encrypts it, and now at this point, you cannot gain access to it no matter how hard you try without the master password. And the great thing is that the way that they designed NordLocker is such that it's able to encrypt any type of file no matter what. So you put it in your NordLocker file, it is going to be encrypted, and you can rest assured that everything is safe. And the great thing about this is that you don't even have to take my word for it. You can head over to nordlocker.net/Luke Stevens right now and try the service out completely for free. You can encrypt up to 5 gigabytes of whatever data you need to protect. It's incredibly easy and I cannot recommend it enough. Again, that's nordlocker.net/Luke Stevens. And if you decide to go premium because the service really is that good, just use promo code Luke Stevens at checkout in the coupon field to let them know that I sent you. Again, nordlocker.net/Luke Stevens. So the big question on everybody's minds is, how is all of this crap with Bethesda Game Studios, and specifically this odd Todd fallacy, this idea that you don't need to focus test your games and that you should allow your developers and team members to do whatever they want effectively. How is this going to impact Starfield and the next Elder Scrolls game? And I'm going to be completely honest, I'm not very optimistic. You see, in order for this to change, Bethesda would have to make such a major shift in how they work with their teams that it would effectively require an entire redesign of their company culture and structure. And that's probably not going to happen until the management turns over. In other words, until Todd Howard is gone. And love it or hate it, Todd Howard, in my opinion, isn't going anywhere. He runs and basically owns that studio, not literally, but he effectively runs it, and it's his house, his team. He calls the shots no matter what. I don't think he's stepping down. I don't think he's retiring anytime soon. I think he's going to ride this out, at the very least, through Elder Scrolls 6. I mean, hell, they've already started development on it. What do you want him to do? Leave in the middle of production? That's a recipe for disaster. If you think that would fix all of their problems, you are sorely mistaken. So what's going to happen? Well, to me, it seems pretty clear. It seems like Bethesda Game Studios is going to have to come to terms with the fact that they need stricter guidelines in terms of quality control. They need to take their time with their releases. The public just straight up has higher expectations and standards in terms of quality at this point. They're no longer willing to just forgive a glitchy mess like they were back 10 years ago. People expect a polished experience, especially because other competing studios such as CD Projekt Red are starting to put out much more polished games in the face of Bethesda's somewhat unprofessional approach. People simply expect more. And if Bethesda wants to continue, if Bethesda wants to be successful, and if Bethesda wants their next games to be received well, they've got to do better. If I had to make a prediction, I would say that it is incredibly likely that Bethesda is going to put out a game in the form of Starfield that promises a lot and is slightly underwhelming. And then we're going to wait another couple years and they're going to put out the Elder Scrolls 6. Same thing. People are going to forgive them for all of their past sins and ills. People will start to forget, believe it or not, Fallout 76. And the game is going to be mediocre. The game's going to be a glitchy mess because they've already started developing it on the Creation Engine. They're not going to change that. If they're going to change engines, it's going to be after these two games. So I don't expect them to be any different. I hope that there's more soul. I hope that they get back in touch with what made their last few games so successful, but if I had to put my money on it, there's not a lot of reason why that would happen. I mean, really, I think the important thing to remember is that if these releases have been tough on the fans, imagine how tough they must be for the people that are working on them, that spend years of their lives pouring their passion, heart, mind, and soul into this project, only to have it received horribly, and only to have the management royally screw it up at every possible step. You'd be pretty pissed at your bosses, at the corporation above you. You would have disdain for the management at your own company. And unfortunately, history has shown that when employees have that level of disdain for their bosses, for their company, for the broader environment and culture around them, it doesn't end well. And it usually results in a product that is poorly put together, is of a low quality, and is poorly received. So all told, Bethesda's a mess. They're messier than my hair is, like, chaotically sort of frizzy and out of control at this very moment. See, you thought that was just a one-off at the beginning. No, I've tied it back in. We came full circle. The sad truth of the matter is that companies ebb and flow. They make mistakes and they make recoveries, and they make more mistakes and then they make more recoveries, and it's just the cycle that goes on and on ad infinitum. And so if Bethesda wants to make a full recovery moving forward, what they need to do is accept that the odd Todd fallacy was a failure. It was a cool experiment to try out, and it seemed like a good idea, but in effect, it's caused a lot of dysfunction within their company ranks. And if they want to move forward into the next generation of consoles as a well-communicating body of employees and bosses and management and producers, they simply have to undo it. They need a clear company culture and structure. They can't do this thing where they try to wear all different hats and go about the development process like it's a kindergarten experiment building Legos. It just doesn't work. But that's it from me. Thank you for watching, honestly and truly. I love you all more than you could possibly know, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace out.